We are now in our reading segment of stream, and as you know that we have been reading Song of the Sariels lately, but with it being Halloween month, I'm going to do something a little bit different, and I'm going to read a story by Edgar Allan Poe. This one we're going to be reading today is called The Masque of the Red Death. We are going to be reading it off of poststories.com, so I'm going to go over to browser cam. If you would like to follow along, we have the link to the website. They have a huge collection of stories by Edgar Allan Poe. I'll be reading this here, and it's not a super long story, but it might be, it might take me a little while to get through it. But as far as the content of the story, it is about a deadly disease going on, like a plague sort of going around, and a couple of rich people trying to get out of trouble, basically. Nothing too content warning-y, I guess, unless you kind of are uncomfortable with, like, stories related to, like, disease and death and that sort of thing. It's, like, major content warning I can think of. It's not too bad. Now, this was written in 1850. Very old story. But let's go ahead and jump right into reading this one, and then we'll get on to World of Horror. So, without further ado, get comfortable and get ready for The Masque of the Red Death. The Red Death has long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal, or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal, the redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains, sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores with dissolution. The scarlet stains upon the body, and especially the face of the victim, were the pest ban which shut him out of the aid and sympathy of his fellow men. And the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were the incidents of half an hour. But Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and dames of his court, and these retired to the deep seclusion of his castellated abbeys. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own eccentric and yet august taste. A strong and lofty wall girdled it in. The wall had gates of iron. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and massy hammers and welded the bolts. They resolved to leave means of neither ingress nor egress to the sudden impulses of despair or frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned. With such precautions, the courtiers might bid defiance to the contagion. The external world would take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. The prince had provided all the appliances of pleasure. There are buffoons, there are improvisatori, there are ballet dancers, there are musicians, there is beauty, there is wine. All these in security were within. Without was the Red Death. It was toward the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most frivolously abroad, that Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade, but first let me tell of the rooms in which it was held. There were 7, an imperial suite. In many palaces, however, such suites form a long and straight vista, while folding doors slide back nearly to the walls on either hand, so that the view of the whole extent was scarcely impeded. Here the case was very different. As might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bizarre, the apartments were so irregularly disposed that the vision embraced but little more than once at a time. There was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn a novel effect. To the right and left, in the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window looked upon a closed corridor, which pursued the windings of the suite. The windows were of stained glass, whose color varied in accordance with the prevailing hue of decorations of the chamber into which it opened. That at the eastern extremity was hung, for example, in blue, and vividly blue were its windows. The second chamber was purple in its ornaments and tapestries, and the panes here were purple. The third was green throughout, and so were the casements. Fourth was furnished and lighted with orange, the fifth with white, the sixth with violet. And the 7th apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon a carpet of the same material and hue. But, in this chamber only, the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood color. Now, in no one of the 7 apartments was there any lamp or candelabrum amid the profusion of golden ornaments that lay scattered around to and fro, depended from the roof. Excuse me. There was no light of any kind emanating from lamp or candle within the suite of chambers. But in the corridors that followed the suite, there stood, opposite each window, a heavy tripod bearing a brazier of fire that projected its rays through the tinted glass and so glaringly illuminated the room. And thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. But in the western or black chamber, the effect of the firelight that streamed upon the dark hangings through the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in the extreme, and produced so wild a look upon the countenances of those who entered, that there were few of the company bold enough to set foot within its precincts at all. It was in this apartment, also, that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang. And when the minute hand made the circuit of the face, and the hour was to be stricken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so particular a note and emphasis that, at each lapse of an hour, the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause, momentarily, in their performance, to hearken at the sound, and thus the waltzers perforce ceased their evolutions, and there was a brief disconcert of the whole gay company, and while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale, and the more aged and sedate passed their hands over their brows as if in confused reverie or meditation. But when the echoes had fully ceased, a light laughter at once pervaded the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled, as if their own nervousness and folly, and made whispering vows, each to the other, that next chiming of the clock would produce in them no similar emotion. And then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embraced 3,600 seconds of the time that flies, there came yet another chiming of the clock, and then were the same disconcert and tremulousness and meditation as before. But in spite of these things, it was a gay and magnificent revel. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. He had a fine eye for colors and effects. He disregarded the decora of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery, and his conceptions glowed with barbaric luster. There were some who would have thought him mad. His followers felt he was not. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure that he was not. He had directed, in great part, the movable embellishments of the 7 chambers, upon occasion of this great fate. And it was his own guiding taste which had given character to the masqueraders. Be sure they were grotesque. There were much glare and glitter and piquancy and phantasm. Much of what has been since seen in Hernani. There were arabesque figures with unsuited limbs and appointments. There were delirious fancies such as the madman fashions. There were such of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that which might have excited disgust. To and fro in the 7 chambers there stalked, in fact, a multitude of dreams, and these, the dreams, writhed in and about, taking hue from the rooms and causing a wild music of the orchestra to seem as the echo in their steps. And, anon, there were strikes of the ebony clock which stands in the hall of the velvet. Then, for a moment, all is still. All is silent, save for the voice of the clock. The dreams are stiff frozen as they stand, but the echoes of the chime die away. They have endured but an instant. A light, half-subdued laughter floats about them as they depart. And now again the music swells, and the dreams live and writhe to and fro more merrily than ever, taking hue from the many-tinted windows through which stream the rays from the tripods. But to the chamber which lies most westwardly of the 7, there are now none of the maskers who ventured, for the night is waning away, and there flows a ruddier light through the blood-colored panes, and the blackness of the sable drapery appalls, and to him whose foot falls upon the sable carpet, there comes from the near clock of ebony a muffled peal and solemnly emphatic than any which reaches their ears to who indulge in the more remote gaieties of the other apartments. But these other apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly the heart of life. And the revel went whirlingly on, until at length there commenced the sounding of midnight upon the clock. And then the music ceased, as I have told, and the evolutions of the waltzers were quieted, and there was an uneasy cessation of all things as before. But now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the bell and the clock, and thus it happened. Perhaps more of thought crept, with more of time, into the meditations of the thoughtful among those who revelled. And thus, too, it happened, perhaps, that there were the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sank into silence. There were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of the presence of a masked figure which had arrested the attention of no single individual before. And the rumor of this new presence, having it spread itself whisperingly around, those arose at length from the whole company a buzz, a murmur, expressive of disapprobation and surprise, and then, finally, of terror, of horror, and disgust. In an assembly of phantasms which I have painted, it may well be supposed that no ordinary appearance could have excited such sensation. But in truth the masquerade license of the night was nearly unlimited. But the figure in question had out-Heroded Herod, and gone beyond the bounds of even the prince's indefinite decorum. There are chords in the hearts of the most reckless which cannot be touched without emotion, even with the utterly lost, to whom life and death are equally jests. There are matters of which no jest can be made. The whole company, indeed, seemed now deeply to feel the costume and bearing of the stranger neither wit nor propriety existed, but the figure was tall and gaunt, shrouded from head to foot in the habiliments of the grave. The mask which concealed the visage was made so nearly to resemble the countenance of a stiffened corpse that the closest scrutiny must have had difficulty in detecting the cheat. And yet, all this might have endured, if not approved, by the mad revellers around. But the mummer had gone so far as to assume the type of the Red Death. His vesture was dabbled in blood. His broad brow, with all the features of the face, was besprinkled with scarlet horror. When the eyes of Prince Prospero fell upon the spectral image, with which a slow and solemn movement, as if more fully to sustain his role, stalked to and fro among the waltzers, he was seen to be convulsed, in the first moment, with a strong shudder, either terror or distaste, but in the next his brow reddened with rage. "Who dares?" he demanded hoarsely from the courtiers who stood near him. "Who dares insult us with this blasphemous mockery? Seize him and unmask him, that we may know whom we are to hang at sunrise from the battlements." It was in the eastern or blue chamber in which stood the Prince Prospero as he uttered these words. They rang throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clearly, for the prince was a bold and robust man, and the music had become hushed at the waving of his hand. It was in the blue room where stood the prince, with a group of pale courtiers by his side. At first, as he spoke, there was a slight rushing movement of his group in the direction of the intruder, who, at the moment, was also near at hand, and now, with deliberate and stately step, made closer approach to the speaker. But from a certain nameless awe with which the mad assumptions of the mummer had inspired the whole party, there were found none who would put forth a hand to seize him, so that, unimpeded, he passed within a yard of the prince's person. And while the vast assembly, as if with one impulse, shrank from the centers of the rooms to the walls, he made his way uninterruptedly, but with the same solemn and measured step which had distinguished him from the first, through the blue chamber to the purple, through the purple to the green, through the green to the orange, through this again to the white, and even thence to the violet, ere a decided movement had been made to arrest him. It was then, however, that the Prince Prospero, maddening with rage and the shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers, while none followed him on account of a deadly terror that had seized upon all. He bore aloft a drawn dagger, and approached, in rapid impetuosity, 2 were in 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure. When the latter, having attained the extremity of the velvet apartment, turned suddenly and confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped gleaming upon the sable carpet, upon which, instantly afterwards, fell prostrate in death the Prince Prospero. Then, summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of revelers at once threw themselves into the black apartment, seizing the mummer, whose tall figure stood erect and motionless within the shadow of the ebony clock, gasped in unutterable horror at finding the grave cerements and corpse-like mask which they had handled with so violent a rudeness untenanted by any tangible form. And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revelers in blood-bedewed halls of their revel, and died each in despairing posture of his fall. And the life of the ebony clock went out with that of the last of the gay, and the flames of the tripods expired, and darkness and decay and Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. I love this story. I know it's got a lot of that old-timey kind of speak, but I do love me a story where the rich people hole up in their little house trying to avoid the suffering of the common folk, but then the disease finds them and they've kind of locked themselves into their own little home and no one came to save the prince. You know, he thinks that all his little rich friends are going to help him, but nope, nobody goes to save him. Nobody goes to save the rich people. Spooky. I love a story where what a shame. What a shame. Also, Raymond, welcome. Rainerberg, welcome on in. I love this book. This is story. I just love a story about where the rich people are the people suffering the horrors. But yeah, you kind of see it coming. You know, as soon as the scary looking masquerader shows up, you're like, nah, he's not a masquerader. That mask is his face. He's a zombie. That's his face. But still, it's still fun, even if you see it coming, the suspense and stuff. It's very creepy. I love it, though. We love a horror story in this house. So yeah, that's a pretty good one. I like that one a lot. Next week, I think I'll read The Pit and the Pendulum, which is another pretty famous story by Edgar Allan Poe. Who will think of the rich people? I know. Yep. They might have avoided the Red Death for 6 months, but then the Red Death came for them, so, you know, good story. You know, especially when you think about it, the way COVID is nowadays, and the rich people kind of flying away and avoiding, not wearing masks and kind of, masks are for people, or, that's for the common folk. We're just gonna hole up in our little islands and it'll be fine. Anyway, so that was our reading segment for today. I know we're running a little behind. We'll try to do 1 or 2 runs in World of Horror. Let me switch categories. But yeah, I love me a good spooky story. Shit really hasn't changed. Yeah, this story was written in 1850, I think. See.